So a bit of a change of gear here, because we've been talking about how to have better conversations with people that we don't agree with. And then sometimes there are people darkly working in our space who mean to disrupt us. And so now we're going to focus on the SpyCops inquiry, and we could not have better people on the stage. I'm so pleased. I'm pleased to welcome both Tom Fowler back to this stage. Tom, you've been coming and telling us about this inquiry for how long?
Oh, God, years.
It's years and
10
years.
10 years plus, yeah.
You can't get more specialist than Tom. He has, I think, turned up to pretty much every bit of the inquiry.
Yeah.
So he's our forensic expert. And Shane Collins, very well known to this space. Shane is a councillor, local councillor, double hatter, I think, in Frome and Somerset, and is a director of the festival and has been an activist for 20 years. So I'm really glad that they're here. Can you give them and yourselves a very big round of applause?
Oh, yeah? How's it going? Just quickly, how many people here have heard of SpyCops? I'll give an introduction anyway, but yeah, most of you know what we're on about. Just quickly, I mean, when we talk about SpyCops, we're talking about the undercover police officers that infiltrated political groups in the UK. Specifically, we're talking about two units, the Special Demonstration Squad and the National Public Order Intelligence Unit. They were exposed in 2010 with the unmasking of Mark Kennedy, which led to like a bit of a media storm around his particular deployment and the things he got up with. But it took a few years before a public inquiry was called, but we kind of got the whole of the sort of the wider unit that he was a part of, which was the NPORU, and the previous unit that predated it, the SDS, has been the subject of this public inquiry. The SDS was first founded in 1968, following the protest against the Vietnam War in the May of that year, which was in Grosvenor Square. It was quite a famous demonstration where the police lost control and protesters supposedly nearly stormed the US Embassy. This led to a meeting of senior police officers and the Home Secretary the next day, where a senior member of Special Branch called Conrad Dixon said, "Give me £500,000 and 10 good men and this will never happen again." That might be apocryphal. It's something that Conrad Dixon wrote in his own obituary. The kind of men who set up these undercover police units like doing things like writing their own obituaries. They like to have control of the narrative in perpetuity. But certainly that the unit was first set up then. It infiltrated the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, specifically to derail the second national demonstration in the October of that year, which it was successful in doing. But then it was deemed such a success, it was rolled out, and they went on to infiltrate left-wing groups across the board. They notably didn't infiltrate the far right, but pretty much anybody else, whether that was socialist, anarchist, environmentalist, anti-war, anti-fascist, feminist, pretty much anything really on the left got infiltrated. The officers, after like a bit of they took a few years to kind of work out what their sort of overriding strategy would be, but pretty quickly it became that they would send officers undercover for a period of around 5 years. Early on, it took by about 1974, they'd sort of realised that targeting individuals for long-term intimate relationships was a really effective way of getting inside groups and staying within the circle of trust of those groups. So it became pretty common for undercover officers to target an individual within an activist group or someone who's just in the same social circle around it for a sexual relationship. Unsurprisingly, some of those sexual relationships ended up resulting in children. The officers abandoned them. At the end of their 5-year deployment, they abandoned those children and returned to their normal lives. All the officers were married with children in the first place in order to be a member of that unit. It was considered that the officers needed to have that kind of anchor in the real world, and otherwise there was a fear that somehow they might go native otherwise. But yeah, so the officers, they would take the identity of a dead child. There's a bit of a misnomer about this. People think it's like they took the names of dead children. They certainly did take the names of the dead children, but they did a lot more than that. They would spy on the families of the bereaved, work out where that child would have gone to school, where they may have likely ended up working, what was the big employer in that area, and then sort of merge that story of what that life that child could have had with their own personal lives in order to create their legend. in order to make themselves like a rounded individual in order to present themselves to the groups that they were infiltrating. So that's the sort of the background of who those officers were. The undercover policing inquiry, which was called in 2015, it didn't get underway until about 2020, and it is going at a very slow pace. Anybody who was here last year, I just gave the update on what had happened over the previous 12 months, so what I'm going to focus on today is what's happened in the last 12 months. Since I was last here, we've had part 2 of tranche 2, which is a very weird word, tranche. I find myself saying it a lot because the inquiry uses a lot of weird legalese language, and I might have gone slightly native myself in that world of legal language and legalese. But this section was focusing on deployments that started after 1982 and before 1993. So there was a time period where when I came last year, we just had a month of hearings. Last time, if anybody, was any of you here last year when I gave an update last year? Yeah, there's a few of you, but maybe I'll recap some of that stuff as well. And that's when we heard from Trevor Morris, who had infiltrated the family of Stephen Lawrence and numerous other. He was one of the very few black undercover officers, so he very much targeted campaigns for justice after deaths in custody. But then what we had for the most part from October to February of this year, we had officers, they typified it as the animal rights officers, so the officers who had infiltrated animal rights groups. I would say that what the commonality between them more was that they'd all had very significant relationships, those officers, so there was a lot more to sort of deal with. Most noticeably, most famously, as Bob Lambert, who was an undercover officer who infiltrated London Greenpeace. He was one of the authors of the What's Wrong with McDonald's leaflet, which led to the McLibel campaign. Longest trial in English history, which included Dave Morris, who was there. He's over there.
Hey.
Deserves a round of applause.
Hey.
A legend of our movement and a bloody good bloke as well, who's also been at many, many days of the inquiry with me, though he less likely to jump on the microphone when I do the updates throughout the day, though I do try and drag him in as often as I possibly can. So we heard from Bob Lambert, who infiltrated London Greenpeace. He went on to he's deceived 4 different women into long-term intimate relationships, all of which overlapped. Significantly, he had a child with one of those women, a child that he then abandoned. We heard from her at the inquiry, as well as Belinda Harvey, who he seduced into a long-term relationship as well. She was one of the authors of Deep Deception, which is a book that 6 of the women who were deceived into long-term relationships have written, which is now the subject of a ITV documentary series, Undercover Love and Lives Exposed, which was on earlier this year, which I think was quite a good introduction to the topic, and I certainly recommend it if anybody hasn't seen it. So we heard from him. He gave evidence for was it 9 days, Dave? He gave evidence for 7. Yeah, I mean, it felt like years, to be perfectly honest. Obviously, these men are professional liars. So, I mean, I go along to these hearings ostensibly to sort of like find out the truth, right? That's kind of what you kind of think you're doing when you go to something like a public inquiry and you hear from the people involved from the topic that you're trying to find out about. You don't hear a lot of truth from the undercover officers themselves. I mean, they are professional liars, and they do have a whole bunch of things that they want to keep secret, things that they're looking to play down, and things they're looking to play up. And I think of all of them, Bob Lambert gave us a masterclass in saying absolutely nothing at all at length. So we got a lot of nonsense, a huge amount of nonsense. Didn't get much in the way. I mean, he certainly... So some of the officers, like we heard from Andy Coles, who was the brother of the Reverend Richard Coles, who deceived a woman called Jessica into her first serious relationship when she was 19 years old. He was pretending to be like 23. He was actually 34. It's quite common. Seems most of these undercover officers would, given the opportunity, they'd shave a few years off their actual age to like kind of relive their youth. I mean, it is quite interesting how much, as well as the sort of the political dimension of why they were deployed, which supposedly was to prevent public disorder and to head off subversion, which is a very nebulous term. A lot of the inquiry, every undercover officer asked to like define subversion. Every officer has given a different answer to that question. It's very sort of wide ranging, but I mean, what a big element of as well has been what one of the one of the lawyers, for members of the public, has pointed out, is this sort of dark playground that the undercover officers were allowed to kind of inhabit as part of their deployment, where they could like fulfill their desires in various different ways. You know, I mean, like some of them kind of started bands and kind of became DJs and did all those things that they kind of wish they'd done in their 20s, but you know, they were too straight to do. But now they were undercover officers, they could do it. I mean, there's a very, very dark sort of sexual side to that dark playground. Yeah, which, I mean, I think I'd really recommend either reading Deep Deception or watching the TV show. I mean, the women give a very powerful testimony about all that, and I think you should find out about that from there. But yeah, these officers' deployments supposedly to stop these two things. I mean, what we've learned from looking at all their reports, they filed quite a lot of reports, about 2 a week generally. What they mostly were doing was building lists. Lists of people who came to meetings, lists of people who bought copies of the newspaper their group was selling, as well as targeting like animal rights groups and things. A lot of them, I mean, the single most infiltrated group was the Socialist Workers' Party. Now that may be because the Socialist Workers' Party is a threat to British democracy, or it may be because the Socialist Workers' Party makes a lot of lists. They make lists of members, they make lists of potential members, they make lists of other members of the left who are in similar groups in their area, they make lists of possible political opponents. Certainly some of the undercover officers would look to set up a new group in an area, which meant that the Socialist Worker Party Central Committee would go, well, here's our list of people in that area who's possible recruits for this new branch. And then they just report that list and then not bother setting up the branch. These lists aren't just names of people, it's names, addresses, employments, trade union affiliation, who else they're connected to. We had one former undercover officer, Vincent Miller, who claimed that when he infiltrated the SWP in Walthamstow, he said nobody who bought a copy of the Socialist Worker in Walthamstow went without him at least seeing where they lived. So if you bought a copy, he'd make sure that he followed you back to your address. So he got the address for everybody bought, at the very least, if not more. This huge amount of information, and it is enormous. I mean, some of the reports have got thousands of names in them as they infiltrated like national gatherings and larger events, and would go out their way to get in positions where they could get the attendee lists or membership lists or so forth. All this information was fed into the vetting procedure, blacklisting, essentially. And we've heard, have people heard of blacklisting? I mean, it kind of got famous a lot around the construction industry, a lot around people who work in health and safety being like prevented from having a career in the construction industry because it's obviously bad for profits for people to, be safe at work and not die horribly in industrial accidents. But I mean, this blacklisting was much further. People who, not just industries like construction, but preventing people from really entering like the civil service, the BBC, entering positions of influence really in British society. It's the way in which when you think about it, in the way in which the New Left sort of like developed in the 1960s and how that sort of wider politics kind of gains a certain amount of momentum through British society through the 1970s, how that really was prevented from like entering the institutions of Britain. I mean, that was done very deliberately. There was a very deliberate way of like keeping those people out of British society and in positions of influence within society. So, at the same time, obviously, the right weren't targeted in that way. So despite the fact that the far right in Britain really have never had that sort of level of support that the left did in the late 60s, early 70s, they've been able to like kind of flourish without that repression into a situation where now we have them setting the agenda in so many ways. Obviously, they've got the billionaire class on their side and all the things that the billionaire class own, but I think that's a really significant part of how the right have managed to flourish, whilst the left is left always reinventing the wheel, maybe, I guess is one way of putting it, as various projects are always shut down by not just the existence of these undercover officers, but a wider sort of infrastructure of repression that the state employs. Throughout the course of the inquiry, we get little glimpses of like other sort of sections, governmental committees and other departments, other sections of Special Branch, MI5 and MI6, who've taken interest in this stuff. I mean, some of it we hear we hear some amount of detail of. Certainly, the undercover officers weren't just reporting to Special Branch. All their reports were going to Box 500, which is a cipher for MI5. Many of these officers, a great many of these officers, went on to have much more significant espionage roles within MI5, MI6, across Europe, further afield. Certain of the officers went on to head security departments of multinational corporations and so forth. Trevor Morris went on to set up Special Branch Baghdad in the aftermath of the Iraq War. I forget the name of the guy who went on to be an advisor to the Qatari police. But we see these sort of these little glimpses. Some of it is subject to restriction order. Something gets blurted out in the hearing. If you're not there, you'd never hear it. I'm duty bound not to repeat any of it, but we do get glimpses of a much wider sort of spook world, I guess you could call it, of covert intelligence sources that exist. Some certainly within like Special Branch, these two units were undercover officers who were going into groups with names, with identities. But there were a great many more undercover officers who would go in with a much more shallow. They used to call these officers, of which we're talking about, as the deep divers, but they're also the shallow swimmers. People who would use their first names, go to protests, maybe go to a public meeting, something like that. Not really embed themselves in the groups in the same way. Or there was the other there were the spotter groups who would be in the same pubs, in the same cafes, in the same places, wouldn't identify themselves, wouldn't strike up conversation with people necessarily, but be hanging around, be one of those familiar faces that were always seemed to be in the pub the same day that the group had meetings and so forth. So there was, it was much more than just those individual units. We had hearings from October through to February of this year. As I say, most of them focused on the animal rights movement, though there were a few other movements that were looked at. Some of these officers have got huge levels of secrecy around their identities. We often don't know either their real names or their cover names. We just get the HN cipher number. And in some cases, certain officers don't even have a cipher number that we can refer to because their level of secrecy is so high. So it is sometimes very difficult. We kind of get a sense of like, oh yeah, one of the people involved in that particular thing, as well as the officer we're looking at, there was another undercover officer. Who that undercover officer is, we don't know. We don't have a cipher for them. We don't have a name for them. This has a terrible problem of feeding into the paranoia about the past, because obviously these are lived experiences of many of the people who attend the inquiry. We haven't got to the period where it comes to my own, the group that I was a part of who was infiltrated yet, but I know I've got lots of unanswered questions about other people who were around at that time. I probably won't get any answers to that. How are we doing for time? Yeah, good. This set of hearings was up till 93. The next set of hearings will be starting in this October. That'll be looking from deployments that started after 93 until 2007, when the Special Demonstration Squad was wound up. It was wound up because they were compromised. That was something to do with DICE, the Defence Systems Exhibition International, the arms fair, which happens every 2 years in East London. This September. Thanks, Patrick. First week of September this year. Please go down and make it as unpleasant as possible for the people who sell arms. So they won't have won. That's the really bloody key thing. I'll come back to it later, but there's this thing about, what can we do about these undercover officers? And I always say, it's keeping doing the thing they're trying to stop, I think it's really important we keep turning up to those things. But yeah, so that the SDS was wound up in 2007. This next section of the inquiry will look at the last 14 years of their deployments. And Shane will talk a bit about the kind of things we'll be looking forward to hearing about in that section. After that, the chair has just announced a few days ago that he'll be retiring after that. He'll be doing an interim report on the SDS. And then the inquiry is going to have to appoint another chair to look at the NPORU, the National Public Order Intelligence Unit, which is what Mark Kennedy was a member of, and a number of, like Lynn Watson, Marco Jacobs, essentially the officers who were deployed when Kennedy was exposed or just left the field. There are a lot of us who are very cynical about how quickly Yvette Cooper will appoint a new chair for this inquiry. And there is a fear, I think a realistic fear, that without sustained pressure, the inquiry may never get to that second section. Certainly, the experience of Leveson, where Leveson 2 has clearly not happened, shows that public inquiries can very easily be derailed. So, there's a danger that this interim report about this next section will be the end of the inquiry. We hope not, because there's so much to look at later on. Obviously, the NPORU, unlike the SDS, wasn't wound up because of internal problems. It was wound up because it was found out about. And it wasn't really wound up. It was just merged into Counter-Terrorism Command, CO11. So the officers who were the management at that time are probably still in quite senior positions now. So there's a lot more at stake for the police once we start looking at that. But I'll just hand over to Shane. He can talk a bit about what we can expect for this next section of the inquiry.
Thanks, Tom. So there's a couple of things I want to fill you in on, because I think it's fair to say that we probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for undercover coppers and what they did to the Big Green Gathering. But I just want to go back a bit and talk about how undercover police infiltrated Reclaim the Streets and the Camp for Climate Action, and in particular the Last Chance Saloon, which was a fundraising bar for the climate camp at the Big Green Gathering. As Tom mentioned, Dave, myself, about 180 people are core participants in this undercover policing inquiry. That means we have been spied on, and so we get to hear about the people who spied on us, read all their reports, that sort of thing. There were obviously a lot of other groups and people that were spied on that haven't been given core participant status. We reckon it was around about 1,000 groups that were infiltrated at some stage. So Reclaim the Streets, just to go back to the early 90s, Reclaim the Streets sprung out of Twyford Down, various different actions, and then Reclaim the Streets got subsumed into the M11 protest. When M11 was over, Reclaim the Streets took the idea of street parties, which Claremont Road, much of the M11 essentially was a party in the street, with lots of scaffolding and tunnels and towers and everything else. But after M11, Reclaim the Streets took on this idea of trying to mix politics and culture with huge, big street parties, which were extremely successful. And the penultimate of that was probably the M41 in Shepherd's Bush, a large street party on that bit of motorway around M41. That was the sort of, I think, probably the zenith of Reclaim the Streets activity, because at that stage, Jim Boyling, who was the spy embedded in Reclaim the Streets, was just driving a truck. And like all undercover police officers, they shared various characteristics. They were very organised. They had a vehicle, very useful. They had a debit card, and they all had a strange sort of job that meant they had to drift off at some stage. So after after M41, Jim Boyling moved up, onto the locations group with Reclaim the Streets. So that would be a group of about 6 people who were the only people who knew what the next target location was. And I think that's particularly relevant for J18 in 1999, which was a sort of stop the city, pointing out all the dodgy financial things going on around the city. And the particular target was the Liffey building, the London International Futures Exchange. I remember going in there after it had been, people had gone in there, all the reception area, mirrored glass, 2 floors high, had been smashed. There was pitch battles on the escalators going up to the trading floors. I remember walking around there thinking, where are the coppers? That's a bit strange, isn't it? And eventually, after about half an hour of my being there, probably about 85 minutes from when it was initially broken in, a line of coppers appeared. The point being that the police, through Jim Boyling on the locations team, knew exactly where the target was at the Liffey building. And I think it's fair to say they let it happen. And that enabled the police and the media to portray Reclaim the Streets as, dangerous, violent, terrorists, whatever. And that really gave the police and the media reason to clamp down even more on Reclaim the Streets. So meetings, people followed home after meetings, all this sort of thing. After Reclaim the Streets, the climate camp, just moving on a few years to the early noughties. Climate camp was quite a few activists from Reclaim the Streets, again trying to broaden the view away just from climate change, just from transport, to bring in sort of how the global financial system works. And so climate camp tactics were to take over a space for a week, camp there, be as difficult as possible, get media attention, bring these issues to the fore, and hopefully push politicians to make changes as a result of that. So Drax Power Station, Heathrow, Heathrow in particular was very successful in stopping a new runway for another 10, 15 years. Obviously it's come back again now, but it's probably still not going to happen. But the big victory for the climate camp was the new generation of coal-fired power stations. So at Kingsnorth coal-fired power station in Kent, there was a week-long occupation in a field next to it. We had canoes coming down from London trying to block the port, all sorts of things going on, extremely heavy policing, helicopters going over the camp at sort of 2, 4, 6 in the morning, trying to keep everybody awake, police trying to break in, or at least appear to break in, trying to stress people out. The upshot of that, as a result of the climate camp at Kingsnorth, as a result of loads of different campaigning groups, political pressure was put on Ed Miliband, the then Environment Secretary, and he decided that there would only be this new generation of 11 coal-fired power stations if they were 25% carbon capture and storage. So if 25% of the CO2 emissions were captured and stored. And obviously that kiboshed the whole thing, because then, as now, carbon capture is an incredibly inefficient. It's rather like nuclear fusion. It requires another £10 billion research and another £10 billion. So, that stopped a new generation of coal-fired power stations, which is why Britain's energy emissions have dropped quite a lot, because we moved away from coal and we moved to wind and solar, in particular offshore wind, which was great. I mean, what it really needed to be then and now is community-owned wind and solar, in the locality, so that people have got buy-in. They're also getting a small income out of it, and they're also getting cheaper electricity. So, as mentioned, at the Big Green Gathering, the Last Chance Saloon was the main fundraising event for the climate camp. The Last Chance Saloon bar used to raise about 20 grand a year for the climate camp, that really kept it functioning. And obviously, as it started to get very, very successful, that brought energy companies, corporate interests, police interest. And so Mark Kennedy, who Tom mentioned earlier, who was inserted at Sumac Centre in Nottingham for 7 years, was involved in lots and lots of campaigns. He was part of the logistics team on the climate camp bar. As I mentioned before, van, credit card, very organised. And he, in 2009, obviously every day he would be in contact with his handler twice a day. We think, and we're pretty convinced about this, the police pressurised someone in Mendip Highways Department to delay issuing a road closure licence, very minor bit of admin. And the police used that to say to the Big Green Gathering directors, see you in court Monday morning. This was Friday at 6 p.m. See you in court Monday morning. We won't give you the licence. And they also made sure that all the Big Green Gathering directors and Andy, who owned Fernhill Farm on the Bendips where the Green Gathering was happening, were in the frame to lose any assets they had if we disregarded that licence. So that meant in 2009 the old Big Green Gathering, A, didn't happen, B, had paid out all the infrastructure costs, about 300 grand, and the old Big Green Gathering went bankrupt. So we came back a couple of years later in 2011 as a community interest company, and here we are now. If that didn't happen, probably the big green gathering would have carried on in Mendip, which was a great location. But as it happens, things have worked out reasonably well. We're here. The green gathering is still one of the major sort of networking points on the annual calendar for Greens, and by that I mean environmentalists, social justice activists, to get together, meet, network, plan, scheme, scam, all that sort of thing. I think that's probably, yes. So that's what we know about undercover policing, infiltrating, reclaim the streets, and the old big green gathering.
I think just to say with the inquiry, there'll be a lot of other things that get looked at as well, obviously, for this time period of the next set of the inquiry. But I mean, it's often the case that like the focus of the inquiry is very much on whichever undercover officers they've decided to call and which ones have answered that call to actually appear in court. Many have decided not to attend, they've moved abroad, or they've just failed to turn up. So, for example, we had the situation where, I mean, I don't know how many hundred of hours we had about London Greenpeace meetings, but I think when Dave gave evidence, we had about 20 minutes on the poll tax campaign. It's completely out of sync with the reality of what politically was happening during the time period that the inquiry is looking at. It's quite frustrating often to follow it, because you think, there's all these things that we know that undercover police had their hand in during the time period, but the inquiry is not focusing on that. It's focusing. I mean, we have a great deal of detail about where in the bedroom that the undercover officer slept with the teenage girl that he was deceiving. But not a great deal about the the huge campaigns that kind of maybe included tens of thousands of people. Yeah, perfect example. And I mean, and something which we know, not just the undercover police, but so many other government agencies have their hands in. Are there any questions?
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much. I was at Fernhill as well with you, Kings North, down in Kent there. And I was horrified by the way the police behaved. My question actually is about, you were saying it's right-wing against left-wingers, and yet were they around when Tony Blair was leading the country, and are they around now, as we're assuming they are, with again a so-called left-wing government?
Yeah, so I mean, all the undercover policing units were set up under a Labour government. The Special Demonstration Squad in the late 60s. The NPORU in the early 2000s. The NPORU was set up in the aftermath of RIPA, the Regulatory Investigative Powers Act of 2002, which gave a framework for CHIS, Covert Human Intelligence Sources. I mean, we now have more legislation around covert human intelligence sources which is undercover officers and their agents. So that could be an informer or an infiltrator or a GRAS or whatever. And they have a great deal more powers than they ever did before. So, I mean, yeah, certainly... Labour governments. I mean, I would question whether you could really call the Labour Party a left-wing organisation these days, or for a very long period of time. But yeah, I mean, certainly, yeah, the Labour governments have been instrumental in the deployment of undercover officers on their watch. I mean, it's quite interesting. So we had evidence being given by Peter Hain, Lord Hain, who was targeted in the 1970s for his involvement in anti-apartheid activism, which he was very prominent in. But interestingly, Mark Kennedy deceived a friend of Lord Hain's daughter, Kate Wilson, who has just written a book, actually, Undisclosed, which is very, very good and worth reading. There's a copy of it, their disclosure. Veggies have got copies. So in that, he attended a Christmas party at which Peter Hain was at. And at the time, Peter Hain he was Father of the House, he was Welsh Secretary, he just voted for the Iraq War. But in Mark Kennedy's report, he said that he had made contact with the noted South African terrorist, Peter Hain. And I guess it kind of shows, really, that however much you think like you've kind of entered the the Labour Party might be in government, but it's the establishment's country. It's the Tories' country. They own this place. And however much you might think, people think they get in positions of power through elections or whatever else, there'll always be, outsiders. In terms of what's happening now, I mean, obviously things have changed in terms of tactics because we live in an information age and covert intelligence can be gained through so many different means. We also live in an age of neoliberal policing. So there's a much greater use of non-police sources. The use of the professional infiltrator is very heavily used in criminal cases these days, where a non-police employee, the police employ civilians for all sorts of jobs now. If you go into a police station, you might find a Group 4 employee on the front desk. They use professionals of all sorts of different sorts for criminal work. It's almost certainly the same for political work. The informers database has grown ridiculous amounts. I forget the scale at which it's grown over the last 20 years. So, it'll be different. It won't be these undercover officers who've stolen the name of a dead child who are actually secretly got a wife and kids. Maybe the infiltrators are really who they say they are, but they're passing information on or whatever else they're doing. And the use of technology means that people can be monitored remotely, and that means that the undercover officer within the group might not be known to the people in the group, but it is a real person. People sometimes kind of get it wrong about sort of electronic surveillance. They imagine algorithms and things, kind of computers picking it up. It really is real people. There are thousands of officers sitting at computer screens, accessing everything from CCTV to what you're looking at on your phone at the in real time. To trail people and set them up for things. I mean, things have changed quite a lot because obviously legislation is much more draconian now. And whereas before you had to do various things to manufacture consent for the crackdowns like Shane was talking about, these days, I mean, you can get 4 years for being in a Zoom meeting. So they don't need to do so much to to do that kind of repression. They can just do it anyway. I think also the climate has changed generally. I mean, obviously the climate's changed, but the political climate has changed where civil liberties don't matter so much anymore in the UK. I don't think people care about people's rights so much. I mean, I'm not saying people in this room don't, or this festival don't, but politically, it's much more, you can trample over people's rights much more effectively politically than you ever could before.
I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about Kate Wilson's situation, because my understanding is that she managed to get access to her files through some crazy fucking court case that took 10 years. Yeah. And I think a lot of people thinking that the women whose vaginas have been infiltrated, the least you would want is to know what is written about you. And that is something that all the other women who've managed to so incredibly bravely and movingly and brilliantly speak out in the Deep Deception book and on the ITV documentary, they haven't had the opportunity to do that, and Kate has.
Yeah, I mean, Kate's story is incredible. I mean, so back in 2011, before the statute of limitations ran out, those people who knew they'd been infiltrated managed to bring a case. 8 women brought a case together. Then another 2 women and 1 man from South Wales brought a case at the same time. I was the 1 man. I didn't have my bodily autonomy violated in the same way as the women did, but there was a legal opportunity for me to bring a case, so we brought a case then. We all ended up having to settle after 7 years of going through the pre-trial with the police trying to throw it out and so forth. And eventually, rather than having it heard in open court, which was our aim, because the nature of the way that the British legal system works and legal insurance works, once they offer you a certain amount of money, you have to accept it, otherwise you're liable for the costs. So everybody had to accept it. Now, Kate Wilson, slightly differently for her own personal reasons. I mean, essentially, she was training to be a doctor at the time, and she ended up becoming a nurse because of the stress of the whole situation. So the quantum, it's all getting very technical. Essentially, she was able to turn down the offer in a way in which none of the rest of us were, which meant that she could turn that offer and go to the next stage of hearings, which was to the IPT, the Investigative Powers Tribunal, which is Britain's most secret court. 98.5% of cases that are brought to that court are unsuccessful. Oh, we've got 10 minutes left. Okay, so I'm really in the weeds here. Essentially, it's the most secretive possible court in the UK. Nobody ever gets a positive outcome on it. She did. She got to it. She managed to have that heard in open hearing, which is unheard of for the IPT. And she got full disclosure, unredacted disclosure, which is also unheard of. And she fucking won. It is one of the most incredible... Yeah, a big round of applause for that. I mean, to say against all odds would be like is no exaggeration. And by doing that, she got so many of the women know more about what happened to them from what the disclosure that Kate got than they ever did from the inquiry or any of the other legal instruments that took place. So yeah, she was able to get a lot more information. I really, really recommend reading the book. It's very, very, very good. And it disclosure, yeah. Patrick's waving around a copy there.
You can buy them on the veggie store. Yeah, buy one, they're brilliant.
As you see, she got all of her documents with this document here, completely blank page with the word Kate Wilson on it. But also in the book, fascinatingly, it has the first report from Kennedy on how he got her into his van from a gathering, and the final handwritten Dear John letter left on her pillow when he left her later. So, yeah.
Yeah, really useful, and I'm like Kate is. I mean, if anybody knows Kate, it's pretty fucking incredible anyway. But she, like the way that she's followed, chased that down, was really, really, really exceptional. And as we've learned more from that than any other single thing. Dave, do you want to?
Just a couple of words. So, just with Kate, she not only won, but they declared that the entire operation at that time, police operation, undercover operation, was illegal. And she won on really big points. And that is in parallel with the inquiry. I want to say we're absolutely slaughtering the Metropolitan Police and MI5 and, in fact, all the successive governments that backed all these operations at this public inquiry. Every day is more bad news for the police because of the campaigners and the lawyers, of course, that we're all working with. I just want to say that, to sum up, actually, the police have been forced to make at least 5 grovelling apologies to the public for targeting women, for using dead children's identities for their cover names, for spying on anti-racist groups. That you can probably think of some more that I've forgotten about. And they're going to make some more apologies as the inquiry continues. It's an absolute slaughter as far as I'm concerned. And finally, what the inquiry has proved is that the police trying to undermine these whole range of movements are completely on the wrong side of history. They're on the wrong side of history about the Vietnam War, which was an utter debacle, about apartheid in South Africa. These are all movements they infiltrated. The poll tax, we won the poll tax. Blockades of military bases, Greenham Common. The cruise missiles didn't come in. Greenham Commons now, is it now a public park, I think, or public commons again? And so on. You could go through it. The McLeibel trial, they infiltrated me and Helen during our case. We obviously won that battle hugely against McDonald's and so on. So I just want to say, don't be intimidated. Do carry on doing what we're doing. We're winning, but we have to be stronger and build our movements. I want to say that on Sunday in here at 2:00, I'm going to be leading a discussion about the inspiration that we can get from the movements over the last 50 years. Come along if you want to be inspired and empowered. Thank you.
We've got 2 more questions.
And just to follow on from that, it really is worth remembering that although we have had the full apparatus of the police state trying to stop what we were doing, we have still had amazing successes, and it's really worth remembering them because we do win quite a lot in the end, although, it's desperately depressing now if you think about the state of the climate. This is what Reclaim the Streets, Climate Camp, Twyford, we were scared of climate change then. Unfortunately, the state, instead of listening to us and taking action, chose to ignore and criminalise. And we're now in a situation where, we have gone over 1.5 degrees. Trying to keep below 2 degrees is already looking extremely difficult. We know from the Institute of Actuaries report what 2 degrees is going to look like by 2050, and what the insurance business is saying, that if we can manage to keep above 1.5 but below 2 degrees by 2050, that's going to lead to a global 10% drop in global GDP and a 10% drop in global population. And if we go over 2 degrees by 2050, that's going to lead to a 25% drop in global GDP and global population. And if we go over 3 degrees by 2050, which is a distinct possibility, we are looking at a 50% drop in global GDP and global population. That's about 4 billion people. Before we get to that, obviously increasing areas of the world are becoming unarable, which will mean that those populations will will have to move, normally to the countries around us, around them. And if those countries are not cohesive, if they don't have social capital, people prepared to work together in an emergency, there is a distinct possibility that it will be men with guns guarding remaining resources and a truly horrible future. And there is no doubt that the powers that be, the government, know about this. They've had presentations from Professor Tim Lenton, who was very involved in the Institute of Actuaries report. And Tim is speaking tomorrow, I think it is, which I'd highly recommend. They know what is coming. And I suspect that's a lot of the reason for all this focus on migration and stopping the boats. I just want to finish, Dave mentioned the victories we've had. In the 90s, we stopped the Conservative road building programme. Yeah? Hey! Hey! A lot of activists from Reclaim the Streets then went on and focused on genetically modified foods. We don't have genetically modified foods in our shops. Big victory. There was fracking that got stopped. Coal-fired power stations, I mentioned. So, there may be repression, but we are still having victories. And although the future may be shit, we can make it absolutely less shit. But the key to that is social capital. We know in emergencies people come together because they want to help. We feel good from helping other people. It's nothing to do with money about feeling good. We feel good from helping other people. And when there is an emergency, that's when we've got to pull together. And I particularly recommend Adam a book called Lifehouse, looking at starting out life houses or community climate emergency centres around the country, which are places where people can coalesce, come together when things start getting tricky.
Yeah. I think that's really key, they come at us because we're strong, not because we're messing around, and really taking it seriously and realising how serious we are is really key. But more questions.
Last question.
So that was a kind of broader call to action. Really appreciated that. Is there specific advice you have for young activists? Really specific.
Specific, yeah. I think the really key thing. I'm not about to sort of kind of look at what someone who might be an undercover cop or an infiltrator might be doing. But I can say very definitely about the kind of tactics they use to destabilise, undermine and destroy groups. And that was largely around gossip and scandal and using personal disagreements between people within groups and magnifying them and claiming that those were political disagreements and taking those personal disagreements and turning them to political issues that they used as dividing points in order to split groups apart. And I think that's something which happens a lot in the kind of groups we're parts of. It's not necessarily undercover cops that do that, but whether it's undercover cops or not, it has the same effect of destabilising, splitting and destroying groups. And I think if we can avoid doing that and encourage people to avoid doing that, we'll insulate ourselves from infiltrations greater than any other thing we can do about identifying, the guy with the van, the guy with the dodgy background or whatever. And really, avoiding that pernicious kind of gossip and scandal and all that stuff, which nearly all the undercover cops really traded in. They used trauma a lot. They used trauma for their own personal backstory, to bond with people. They used trauma to withdraw themselves from groups and leave behind a feeling of people having to keep secrets, which would have exposed them if they'd known. But they used a lot of those. They used those things in order to split people up, and I think it's incumbent on us not to do those things. And I would really advise young activists to think about that a lot, particularly when it comes to personal disagreements within groups. A lot of the undercover cops, particularly the early ones, set up a lot of like purity tests within groups. When we heard about the Women's Liberation Front, we're having like 7 or 8 hour meetings about like kind of individuals who'd done something wrong in their personal lives, which made them unfit to be an activist. And these show trials within groups, which were just cancerous to that movement. And it's very easy to fall into these sort of internal policing type behaviours. And I think avoiding that is the most effective thing you can do to insulate yourselves from undercover policing. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.